Welcome back to Morning Joe. Sun's up now over Washington, 7:45 in the morning. Joining us now, national correspondent for PBS NewsHour, Amna Nawaz. Also with us, author Lauren Leader. She's the co-founder and CEO of All In Together, a nonpartisan women's civic and political organization, which is out with new numbers showing political divisions have grown worse since the election of President Trump. Specifically, 71% of men and 70% of women feel the country is, quote, very politically divided, a 30 to 40% increase since 2016. The poll also looks into President Trump's impact on voter motivation, with 67% of voters saying they are more motivated to head to the polls in 2020 versus 2016. 28% felt no difference, while 5% said they felt less motivated. Good morning to you both, and welcome, Lauren.
Morning.
What do you read into these numbers as we head into the 2020 election?
Well, I think it's an incredibly important sign that voters are paying close attention and that they're going to be mobilizing, and that they're incredibly driven by the current environment to potentially make change. And when you look at the numbers, you know, women, particularly Democratic women, 78% say that they are extremely motivated to engage in the 2020 election. It's so important because, of course, women have outvoted men in every election since 1980. They were the deciding factor in the 2018 midterms. And if that kind of motivation translates into action and mobilization, which I'm a little concerned about that. We can talk about some of the numbers there. But if it does, that's bad news for sure for the president.
We've heard enthusiasm before. There was enthusiasm on paper and in polling for Hillary Clinton to become the first woman president of the United States, and a lot of people didn't show up. So what is that gap you're talking about between motivation and activation?
Well, it's fascinating. You know, Americans tend to really misunderstand what actions translate into political outcomes. So what we found in the survey is that women, Democrats, particularly those who are most motivated, they're really motivated to make change, but what they spend the most of their time doing is social media. When we asked them whether they were likely to go out and volunteer for a campaign, whether they were going to make contributions to the campaign, those numbers are actually quite low relative to the time that they spend on social media. That's a problem because Americans really think that social media translates into political outcomes, and it does not. Very little changes ultimately at the ballot box based on how much time you spend on the social media. So we need voters to translate that enthusiasm into the ballot box, but then also into working on behalf of candidates that they are committed to.
Do you see an understanding of that? Any learning from 2016 that a hashtag is not enough? You actually have to go out and work, and then you have to go out and vote after that.
Not as much as we would like, and actually that's what we do at All In Together is we train women across America on the tools of political power, influence, and leadership. We need more women to understand this, and this is an issue for Americans generally. You know, social media does not actually have a mobilizing effect on the electorate.
Lauren, there was one stat in here that was so disturbing and mirrors what unfortunately I've heard so often from voters, that there is a belief that a woman can't win the presidency.
Yeah, so we asked voters to basically prognosticate, to say, you know, who do you think wins? And overwhelmingly, the generic Democrat wins by, you know, huge margins, even among both independent men and women. However, when you ask them about a generic woman candidate, those numbers flip, and the president winds up with an advantage. And I think this reinforces what we've been hearing for the last number of months, the sense that women aren't electable or they can't win. And what we worry about is, of course, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people reinforce this narrative, the worse the less level the playing field actually is for the women candidates. You know, we saw this in 2007 in a lot of the polls about, you know, are Americans ready to elect a black president? People say that they themselves are, but they don't think their neighbors are. They don't think Americans are. And I think you see a very similar trend in this data around women candidates. Yeah. Women like women candidates. They actually say overwhelmingly they think they represent them better. They just worry whether they can win.
Again, to underline the numbers, Jonathan, in this poll, Trump has an 18-point deficit, but only a 9-point deficit if the candidate is a woman, theoretically, in this poll.
So that's exactly right. And Amna, let me piggyback on that. You've done some writing and thinking about the idea of electability, which has certainly been, you know, is the forefront of this discussion about whether a female candidate is perceived as electable or perhaps a minority candidate is perceived as electable. It's also been Joe Biden's sort of #1 argument, maybe not the one that he specifically is making, but those around him are suggesting that he's the guy who can beat Donald Trump. That's why he should be the nominee. What are your thoughts? What are you finding about this idea of electability, and is that going to motivate Democrats when they pick a candidate?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers line up precisely with what I've been seeing in the field when you go talk to voters. This issue of electability, particularly for Democratic voters and likely Democratic voters, is front and center. We've been seeing it in the polls for a while now. Even our latest NewsHour Marist NPR polls show that issue, who can beat Donald Trump, is way more important to some of those voters than anyone who lines up with them ideologically. I mean, the interesting part here, though, is that the idea of electability, right, critics will say it's often wrapped up in who we think can win is based on who has won in the past. And the irony is that when you look at female legislators, the idea that women often have to work harder to win office in the first place, which sometimes means that they perform better once in office. There was a study just a few years ago that showed the average female legislator actually secures more funding for her district. She's actually able to enact more bills than her male counterparts. That aside, people feel the way that they feel right now because they haven't had an example. We've had one female major party nominee, and she lost. And that, unfortunately, matters in how people are factoring the candidates today.
Jonathan Capehart, when you look at Lauren's numbers, it appears she's been talking to Aunt Gloria, North Carolina focus group.
All the aunts.
Yeah.
Yeah, really. That, I mean, it's a bit of a deja vu. But Lauren, as I was looking at the results, I was wondering, do you have a racial breakdown of these women? Because as Congresswoman Fudge said in an earlier segment, African American women are they're the foundation and backbone of the Democratic Party. They are super energized and mobilized. But I'm wondering, where do they fit in this? And also, where do college-educated white women fit? Because if you're going to look at two big, important electorates for 2020, those are the two.
Yeah, and the data was remarkably consistent across all of these groups, and which we thought was really fascinating. And I think, what you heard from your aunts is, very reflective of what we're seeing across the country, this sense of, fear of taking too big of a risk in an election that has such enormous consequences, and the sense that, as your aunt said, or as you said earlier, Jonathan, that somehow the white male candidate is a better matchup against the president. Look, I mean, to this point about turnout, look, any Democrat wins or loses the 2020 election on the enthusiasm and the turnout of women, of underrepresented minorities, and of millennials. That is based on enthusiasm and excitement and the sense that that person speaks for them. So I think there is the potential that this gap winds up closing, because if we start seeing that candidates who really are resonating with those three groups breaking through, I think this dynamic could shift. But again, it's this fear that somehow I get it. I, as an individual voter, would be willing to do this, but I worry that my neighbors won't, that there's bias out there that's going to make it impossible for women to win.
No, it can't just be, though, the fear that a woman can't win or an African American can't win that is keeping Joe Biden so consistently, is it, at the top of the polls. I mean, he has debate performance after debate performance in which he doesn't do very well. The press is spending a lot of time reporting the things that he says out on the campaign trail that are being described as gaffes, and yet voters still like him. There must be something about Joe Biden. Maybe it is just his electability factor, but there is something about Joe Biden that voters are sticking with.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, these terms we're using, right, electability, likability, let's not forget familiarity matters a whole heck of a lot at this stage of the game. It's still very, very early. And a number of the voters who we've been talking to out in the field say, yeah, I know Joe Biden and I like Joe Biden. And that's why, even if I haven't necessarily definitely made up my mind right now, I am leaning towards Joe Biden. But back to the other issue of how some of these Democratic women voters are more likely to perhaps turn out in sort of an anti-Trump way. This is also something we've been fascinated to look at, because when you look at the way that President Trump is messaging right now, when you look at some of the things people may call unforced errors, right? The go back tweets and family separation, the kinds of things that people see as unnecessarily cruel and maybe even questionable policy-wise, if they have any policy behind them at all. Those are exactly the kind of things that a lot of Democratic women and likely Democratic female voters we're talking to out in the field say makes them more motivated to want to show up. They may not have made up their minds about who they're voting for yet, but those kinds of things do motivate them.
So, Lauren, what could Senator Warren or Senator Harris us to do the dynamics, to change the dynamics we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes?
You know, I think the more they keep at their message, the better it's going to be. I mean, look, the irony is, of course, the women running of the senators, they've never lost a race.
Yeah.
These are women who've had incredible track records of success. So I think they're doing a lot of the right things. It's, as they said, it's early. I think these things can change. We've seen it change in the past. I think the Obama election is a good indicator that Americans are open to great candidates, inspiring candidates, and are willing to vote for change when they think it's the right person.
And there's time left.
And
Lauren
there's
Leader,
time.
Amna Nawaz, thank you very much. Good to see you both. Jonathan Capehart, thank you very much. Our best
Thanks,
on
Willie.
Gloria. Still ahead this morning, when it comes to fears of a looming recession, President Trump is blaming his hand-picked Fed chair for, quote, holding us back. We'll discuss that and what to expect from Wall Street today after the Dow's staggering 800-point drop yesterday. Plus, a suspect is in custody this morning after an 8-hour standoff with police in Philadelphia that left 6 officers injured. We'll get the very latest coming up next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.